Hello everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the latest edition of our Keys webinar, our monthly broadcast to our clients around the world. We're so pleased to have you with us today. We've got people from more than 80 countries around the world, which really sets the scene for today's topic, because we really wanted to get into this theme around why context really matters. And with my expert colleagues around the world, we're going to dive deeper into trying to get a closer understanding of how people are living their lives these days and how we can make better decisions based on a better understanding of their context. We're going to start, after a brief introduction from me, with Busi, who joins us from Johannesburg today. And she's going to share with us the latest findings from an Ipsos series called Being Woman, which helps us understand how it is to be a woman in different cultures and different countries. We're then going to talk to Fiona in London, and Fiona's been doing a lot of work looking at international survey results and to try and explore and find out more about where we can see differences and where cultural differences might be as work. Hence her title, When Difference Doesn't Mean Different. And then we're going to be flying to see Chris. He's in Madrid today, and he's going to help us think about the context in which brands can be successful, thinking about how people are living their lives these days. All the way through, please ask any questions you have for our expert speakers, and we'll come to those at the end. We've got a little bit of time for Q&A. But we're going to start by thinking about public opinion, the dynamics of public opinion, and what that tells us about the context of people in their lives these days. I'm going to start with 3 headline reports, and each one of them perhaps tells us something different about the context of where people's minds are. Or What Worries the World study, to start with, asks every month to which of the following topics you find most worrying in your country. We do it in 29 countries. We give them a list of 18 topics and themes, and the big question this month has been, has concerns about inflation peaked? The reason being, it's now the 12th month that inflation has been at the top of the league table of worries. And what we're finding is that after a very steady rise, we're not seeing concerns about inflation increasing any further. However, you'll see that things have more plateaued. They're certainly not going down either. It remains a very, very top of mind issue for people in countries around the world, and certainly a reminder of how the context has shifted from last March, when we were at a little over 25%, or the previous March, when it was less than 10%, mentioning inflation as a big issue facing my country. Let's look at this red line, however. This red line is the proportion mentioning COVID as one of the big issues facing my country. It's now ranked 16 out of 18. It's the lowest ever score, and it comes again at a particular moment in time. It's 3 years since the world went into lockdown. 3 years since that context completely shifted almost overnight for so many of us. That was the starting point for us beginning to run webinars, because we found that people around the world wanted to get the latest information on how people's experiences were changing in different countries as they lived through this extremely unprecedented moment. It was so unprecedented, of course, that we hadn't got the right questions in our survey. In March 2020, we didn't have pandemics or coronavirus in our survey, because it hadn't been the kind of thing we needed to ask about in a tracker like that. Of course, we had to add it quite quickly, and in April 2020, we had COVID mentioned by 61% of people around the world. Now, of course, the context rather different. Thinking about our theme today, I'm mindful that I'm sharing with you results from 29 countries around the world, and possibly running the risk of overgeneralizing. So what happens when we go a little bit to one level lower? Well, here I'll give you an illustration of some work I can exclusively reveal for you today at this webinar, because I created a LATAM index. This was the proportion of people across our 6 countries from Latin America in the survey, and I find that LATAM is similar to the rest of the world. I also find that my LATAM index doesn't really last for more than about 1 minute, because once I start to look at the individual country scores, I get a real reminder of how the context of individual nations around the world, the place where we're living, makes such a big difference. Here we're looking at all 29 countries. You can see March 2022, each of the countries in a different place. Since March 2022, over the last 12 months, everyone's moved in the same direction. We're all more worried about inflation than we were, but the context is so different. And indeed, to come back to my point about Latin America, my index, by making a crude average, doesn't really hold water, because each country is actually in a rather different place. My second report to delve into is all about happiness. You might have been at work on Monday, so you may not have noticed that it was International Happiness Day, but it was, and we did a survey to accompany that moment, trying to understand what's driving people's satisfaction and people's happiness around the world. We found 73% of people saying that they felt happy with their lives these days, and these were the key drivers most associated with people being positive about their current situation. Some themes around my life having meaning, or me being in control of my life. Some themes about wellness, but also themes about some of the basics in terms of living conditions, having shelter, and having the opportunity to stay safe in my life. So those were some of the key drivers that came out of the study. Again, when I went into the details by country, I was able to create quite quickly another index, the Europe Happiness Index. And again, it doesn't last very long, because once I look at the individual scores and disaggregate my index, you can see just how many differences there are by countries. And I need to politely remove the European overall score, because it actually hides more than it reveals. Fiona's going to help us pick through some of the things we need to keep in mind when we are looking at international survey results in just a moment. But still thinking about our theme about the context, really also worth being clear about where people are in their lives. What stage are they in their lives? Or perhaps what's the background in terms of the resources or the assets available to them in their daily lives. So we look at happiness by demographics. One finding is that this is not a survey where I can start writing lots of things about how Generation Z or Generation Z, for example, are different to everybody else. Very little difference by age group. Where we are finding differences is that people who are married are saying they're happier than others, but also people who have more income and people who have a higher level of education. My third report is the study that we've done to accompany International Women's Day, 32 countries around the world. And the two headlines that our team picked out for the press release are this one. I believe there's currently an inequality between women and men in terms of their social, political, or economic rights in my country. Alongside this one, 54% of people saying that when it comes to giving women equal rights with men, things have gone far enough in my country. So two markers to explore the findings in more detail. And as we look at the findings in more detail, you'll notice in the shaded grey areas, we are indeed finding a gender gap in terms of the attitudes of women and the attitudes of men on all of the questions here. But you'll notice also that the differences aren't necessarily dramatic when I'm looking at the overall results around the world and looking at men versus women. We're actually finding much bigger differences when we look at the results by country than when we look at the results just at men versus women around the world. Big difference, 63 percentage points between the Portugal score and the Indonesia score. So a reminder again that there's a number of things that we need to unpick as we try to get into the individual context in which people are living their lives. Busi is going to help us with just that question as she shares with us her perspectives from South Africa based on the research that she's been doing in just one moment. So the International Women's Day report, it'll be in the deck that we'll be making available to all of you who are with us today, a whole series of different segments and chapters to help you go deeper. And we'll be also sharing with you as we go through the next month each of the releases that we're doing. You can find them on ipsos.com and through our social media as we try to stay close to the dynamics of public opinion throughout the world. So that's my introduction, just to set the scene and perhaps remind us of some of the pitfalls if we're trying to look at results around the world. It's time now to look in some more detail now, and I'm so pleased that we have Busi with us, who's been taking us forward in terms of our research from the Being Woman program. It's been in a number of countries around the world. Busi's been leading what we've been doing to understand the results from a South African perspective. Busi, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Simon. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Busi. I'm going to take you through Being Woman. It is a series of workshops that we did in South Africa, speaking about women and their movement from equality to freedom. We did a roadshow throughout the country, and we got beautiful results, but we're going to share with you just a few snippets of what we got out of it. It really was about understanding gender through a cultural lens, right? I mean, we all know that culture is one of the most critical aspects that are shaping gender today. I mean, when you talk about gender in nature or gender in humans, there are those differences. So in nature, there's no quest necessarily for equality, whereas in humans, we know that this is combined with an inner sense of identity. It's a learned concept and it is shaped by culture. This really was curation in action. We synthesized multiple sources of data, of information. We got assets from our global trends data. We took global advisor studies. We got demographic data. We did ethnographies. We did desk research. It really was a smorgasbord of information that we put together, together with face-to-face interviews that we did with consumers, just to hear where they stand, and also just to understand and ultimately summarize the cultural roots for gender around the world. Now, we've done the study in a couple of countries. I'm highlighting China, the United States, and France as some of the ones that have already been done from a roadshow perspective. But when we found things that were being pulled out from these countries, we found China, for example, where it really was more about money, more about pragmatism, whereas in the United States you still had very much being driven by youth. There was polarization. There are tensions around identity beyond just gender. In France, it was about hierarchy versus equality, where it was about égalité, desirability. But when we came to South Africa, which is what was important for us, it really was about reimagining this new Black identity and setting the scope for us, because as brands and as organizations, we're needing to understand where the deep-rooted nuances are when we speak to South African women, so that we can speak to them in a way that is resonating with who they are. So in South Africa, the tensions about physical safety, economic survival were all layered with this need to reconcile traditions, and also the fact that there was this baggage that came through from the apartheid heritage. Women are speaking about diversity. It's about hustling now. It's about ambition. There's a big part that talks to religion, but the biggest pull-throughs were about Ubuntu. I am who I am through you. And the other big one was about badging, because when you think about the baggage that comes with apartheid, where people were not able to have the things or weren't given access to things that others had. Now badging has become this very, very important thing. People need to see that I've arrived. People need to see that I've gotten to a place where I can afford these appliances, I can afford these types of vehicles, I can afford these mobile technology, I can afford this kind of fashion, pulling through very, very heavily in South Africa. There were three things also that we learned about gender, and this was very much from a cultural perspective, right? So the overriding tensions, like I've spoken about, of the most basic freedoms, that being safety and well-being. And then the struggle for South African women to move beyond functional independence to this proud self-reliance, this freedom to pursue our own dreams without fear or inhibitions. And then also profiling South Africa for gender and social culture so that we can work on the what and the how. Most important when you're a brand or an organization, understand so that you can work on the what and the how. So the key findings for South Africa in this tug of gender war, there were three things really that were pulled out during these workshops. It was freedom versus equality came out very strongly. It was the profiling of South African women. And then it was the opportunities for your brand or your organization. What can you do? Right? Because at the end of the day, are women becoming more equal, empowered, happier? And really true empowerment comes when feelings, behavior, and capabilities are in alignment. So it is about what women feel. It's this confidence. It's narrowing the gap between what they want to do and what they actually do. It is what they have. So it's equal access to the right power assets. So education, financial independence, decision making, the jobs that they want, tasks that they want to do, and finally what it is that they want to do. So it's this overarching freedom to be who they want to be, especially when it goes against social norms. Because at the end of the day, whilst all culture acknowledges the importance of gender equality and empowerment, it really does mean different things in each different culture. I am a Zulu person, and things are very different in the Zulu culture compared to the Xhosa culture, compared to the English South African woman or the Afrikaans speaking South African woman. And things are shaped equally by gender issues, so what women want, as well as the larger social culture. So how do we land this within a larger social context that does include men? Because it's important to note that we can't leave men out of this conversation when we're speaking about empowerment. And successful engagement can happen when we understand what aspects drive gender issues in each culture, as well as how do you customize the strategy and the activation to those local cultural drivers. Those are hugely important. And then when you look for those opportunities, here's the opportunity then for you as a brand to offer support. It's about being supportive leaders. It's about single mothers relief when you are in a work environment. It's about relief from additive responsibility, so work and home. It really is about providing that feeling of safety, fun, enjoyment, but the sisterhood, which is a very South African thing and very much rooted in our culture, is the sisterhood. But you also need to acknowledge the fact that there are deterrents. So that limited role models, the lack of education, limited social freedom, the patriarchal society, and also traditional cultural roles which come and are overarching in a lot of instances, which do become deterrents. And what you need to do then is become an enabler. So connect to this ecosystem, be the one that enforces the social change, be the one that brings sisterhood into your communication for your brand, into your activation for your brands, into your organizations, the corporate actions that you do, as well as being that employer who is more of an enabler than a deterrent when it comes to empowerment of the female. So what's next for being women? That was a whistle-stop tour of South Africa, but because it's been so successful, we are on our way now to Kenya, Nigeria, and Egypt. And if you want to know more about being women and how it can help within your organization, all you need to do is just drop us a line on being.women@ipsos.com. We've got a beautiful framework. We sit with you, we craft it according to what you want to get out of it. And at the end of the day, the workshop is very, very successful when it comes to all of or the people that are going to be sitting within your organization, as well as the people that you touch with your brands outside. Thank you. Back to you, Simon.
Well, Boosie, thank you so much. I mean, you said a whistle-stop tour, but it was also an inspiring tour, and also we can see that the kind of the texture and the depth of the work that that you and the team have done to bring that together. So thank you for that. And one of the things I took away from it is I was listening to you. You're talking very much, in the present tense about where women are now and how brands can respond now. But you also actually made us think about the past, about experiences and reference points and indeed baggage, as you described it. And preparing for this webinar, you mentioned that you yourself had some different experience as a girl growing up as the boys you were growing up with. That's right, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, so in my culture, the Zulu culture, finances, if they are limited, are often channeled towards the male child, because the boy child is the one that is seen to be the hope for the future. He has more probability to be the captain of industry. He's got more probability to be running a business, running a household, etc. And usually the girls, well, if we just keep them safe, pretty, someone's going to come and grab her and save her, and it's all going to be good. So what that leads to is that in the present, when you've got women that are running and really trying to be the powers and the captains, if I can put it that way, it's often very surprising to the older generation, because they see all of these things that we do. I mean, my brother was afforded the Harvard degree and I was not. But it's always interesting that even today, with the older generation within my family, they're still surprised today that I've made it, that I'm okay, I'm a single parent and I'm doing it all and whatever. So it is just that baggage stays, and the older you are, the deeper the entrenchment is.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. We're going to come back, and we've already got some questions to ask you before the webinar ends to pick up on some of the themes you've been drawing on. So we'll be back to Boosie very shortly, but we're going to take a flight over to London. But Fiona hasn't just been in London; she's been looking at results from surveys around the world, haven't you, Fiona? And you're going to help us understand how we can do a better job at understanding what's going on when we've got surveys from more than one country, and we need to understand whether difference doesn't mean different. Thanks, Fiona, for joining us.
Thanks, Simon, and hello, everyone. So I'm delighted to be here today to talk about cultural response bias in global research programs. I thought I'd jump straight in with a definition of what cultural response bias is, just to put us all on the same page. So cultural response bias applies to response scales in questionnaires. It manifests itself as a market or country-specific tendency to score at the same place in a scale, regardless of what is being asked. But it's particularly applicable to attitudinal response scales, so things like agreement or satisfaction. And research into cultural response bias has shown that it causes substantial and systemic differences in response patterns between markets. There are three types of cultural response bias that are typically seen. These apply to scales regardless of the number of points in them. So I'm simply using a 10-point scale here for illustrative purposes. The first style that we typically see is acquiescence response. So as the name suggests, this is a tendency to agree regardless of what is being asked. We then have extreme response, so the tendency to use either end of the scale, and the positive end is more commonly seen than the negative end. Then finally, we have middle response, so a preference for the midpoints of the scale. So now that we know that markets have a tendency to score in a particular place on the scale, regardless of what is being asked, we need to have a think about what that means for global or multi-country research programs. Because if we take scores at face value, cultural response bias can undermine the validity of the conclusions that we draw by convincing us that we have top-performing markets or underperforming markets, when really what we're seeing is that bias rather than true performance differentiation. So now we know what cultural response bias is, and we also know about the implications of it. What does it look like, and how do different markets score? Well, this is a slide from some R&D that we did about 6 years ago into cultural response bias. And here we're looking at the percentage of people scoring 8, 9, or 10 across a range of attitudinal metrics in Puerto Rico and in Japan, across the 3 sectors that you see on screen. And I've included this slide because it perfectly illustrates the challenge of cultural response bias. So literature on the topic will tell us that Latin American markets tend to give high scores, whereas Asian markets tend to give mid or even low scores. So with that in mind, do we have an underperformance issue in Japan, or are we looking at cultural response bias? But R&D data can only get us so far before it gets more interesting to look at real-world data, which is what we've got here. So this is data taken from our recently launched CXLens benchmarking database, which we've been populating since 2019 with all eligible Ipsos studies. And here we're looking at Net Promoter Score, or NPS, across an aggregate of about 50 sectors. There's a lot to take in on this slide, so I'm going to move swiftly to some highlighting to make it easier to digest. So first of all, we see a repeat of that pattern we saw in the R&D data. So high scoring Latin American markets on the left and lower scoring Asian markets on the right. Moving to the Middle East, we see positive scoring, but more moderate than those Latin American markets. In Europe, we see a similar pattern of more moderate scoring, but with a greater spread. And then jumping over the Atlantic to US and Canada, we see slightly higher scores, with the US tending to give slightly higher scores again than Canada. And then finally, moving around to Australia and New Zealand, we see scores which are typically in line with European counterparts. And these are patterns that we see repeatedly across metrics and also across sectors. But we also see some interesting patterns emerge. So here we're in Africa, and we can see a pattern emerging of English-speaking markets tending to score high on the left there, and French-speaking markets tending to score low on the right-hand side. Moving around again to Asia, this market and this region is well known for giving mid or low scores, but actually what we also see here is some high scoring markets as well. And this is a pattern that we see repeated time and again. So what can this real world data tell us about cultural response bias? Well, it certainly shows that there's some natural variation and that there are exceptions to norms that we might expect to see, but it definitely also tells us that something cultural is at play. So if we're looking after a multi-market research programme, what can we do about cultural response bias? Well, the first thing that we want to do is provide a level playing field at data collection. So we want identical questionnaires with identical scales and identical use of don't know and not applicable options. Then we need to think about analysis and reporting, and there are lots of things that we can do, but I'm going to focus on 3 options in the interest of time. So the first thing that we can do is track trends over time within each market. This has the benefit of not impacting existing questionnaires, and it also allows us to identify systemic changes because scores will be going up across a region or around a globe, or scores will be going down in a region or around the globe. But of course, it doesn't give us direct comparability between markets. The second approach we have is to rank results within a competitive set within each market. So this approach provides comparability between markets because we can compare the rank position of our brand of interest versus those in other markets rather than looking at absolute scores. It's also easy to communicate because everybody understands the idea of rank. But it does mean that we need to find questionnaire space for competitor ratings, and we also need to identify appropriate competitor sets for each market. The third approach is to recalibrate our own brand scores using ratings of well-known global brands reputed for consistent service or performance delivery. And what we do here is we explore the ratings of those well-known global brands to start identifying the impact of cultural response bias at market level. Once we've done that, we can then recalibrate our own brand scores. And that gives us comparability between markets for our own brand because we've effectively isolated the impact of cultural response bias. But it is a bit more complicated to do, so it can be a little bit more difficult to communicate to the business as well. And like the previous option, it also requires us to find additional questionnaire space for asking about those extra brands and also to decide which brands we should ask about. So on that note, I'd like to conclude by saying that cultural response bias undoubtedly makes our life more challenging or more interesting, depending on your point of view. And there is no single perfect solution. But if we think about it from questionnaire design through to analysis and reporting, and I am advocating here that we definitely should, then we can arrive at reliable global conclusions. So thank you for listening, and back to you, Simon.
Well, Fiona, thank you for that panorama and that reminder. Yes, glass half empty or glass half full, depending on whether we love this or find this a bit of a challenge. But either way, we have to try to do the right thing and make the right decisions for the study that we're working on. And I know you gave us the 3 options, so I'm going to be mean now as the chair. I think I'm allowed to do that and ask you to advise us. If is there one of the 3 that you would particularly be more likely to recommend, generally speaking?
I think so. I mean, obviously, we need to think about the individual needs of the business that we're working with and the sort of data collection options available to us as well. But all things being equal, typically we would advise option 2, so the rank-based approach. As I mentioned, it's a relatively simple approach, so it's easy to communicate and embed within a business. It's easy to understand as well. So it tends to be a more straightforward solution than the final option, but gives that direct comparability that the first option doesn't provide.
Okay, so the league table kind of thing can often work well in terms of activating.
Very much
Excellent.
so.
Well, thank you, Fiona. We'll be back to you as well before we finish the webinar. But Chris has been observing this. He's been thinking about the context of brand success, and I think one thing to observe, just reflecting on what we've seen so far, Chris, is that the shopping list is growing for brands. They need to understand global, regional, country perspectives to come to what we were talking about with Boosie. There's the past and the present, and there are questions about how you measure what good looks like or understand what good looks like. But you're helpfully going to take us home, I think, by giving us your perspectives and the work you've been doing on how brands can be more successful and what the context needs to be for doing just that. So Chris, thank you for coming and joining us again on the Keys stage.
Yes, and thank you for having me, Simon, and hello, everyone. Let's talk a bit about the context of brand success. I think it's safe to say that many of us have been trained for most of our professional lives that brands can be measured through a combination of rational and emotional associations. But I'm going to share some evidence with you here in the next 8 minutes that might suggest that's true, but it's only telling a partial story. And we want to make sure that as measurement professionals that we're telling a true story of contextual brand choice. Now, I think it's also fair to say that many of us have been taught and trained that to either manage or measure brands, it needs to be on kind of a static prescription for greatness. We prescribe what's good, and then we measure those things. Some of these words might resonate with you. Meaning, difference, mental availability, physical availability, even love. And in these systems, sometimes the metrics become the stars and the only path to brand success. But if you think about the way you purchase brands, even think about some of the stuff you bought this week. Did all of those brands really have to check all of those boxes, those static boxes, to be successful, to convert a sale? And if you think about that really hard, is it any wonder that we see some of the brand scores that are coming from research don't always match up so well with in-market sales realities? Now, I'd say the truth is that brand selection is highly contextual, and that brand building is a continuous process of shaping and reinforcing consumer expectations. So our new brand success framework looks at 3 essential dimensions. The first one is all about shaping expectations. And when we say expectations, we're talking about what people feel and believe about a brand. And for those of you who might have tuned in to Keys last time, you heard Manisha Banerjee talk quite a bit about expectations. And I think she landed the points really clearly that it is a brand leader's job to shape expectations in a way that only their brand can meet them. She also landed a point that if we're good at that and we do properly shape expectations, there are a couple really nice side benefits there. One, it makes people more likely to choose your brand, but then secondly, it very positively frames their expectations for the ensuing experience. So to do that well, brands have to really understand the humans that they serve and how their personal and environmental context is constantly changing. So when we talk about context, we're talking about what's happening in people's lives and the world around them. And then when we're talking about empathy, we're talking about really meeting people where they live, where they are, feeling what they feel, showing that we can share their values, and then acting on that understanding. So brand building is really a continuous process of shaping expectations in context with empathy. And this idea is not just a theory. In some extensive R&D that we've done in different categories and countries, we have built quite a mountain of evidence that suggests these things all play a very meaningful role in driving brand choice. And what I'm going to do on this slide is summarize some of the findings from our latest studies that are really attempting to tell a much more full, modern, and complete story of brand choice. So here, we've been able to quantify the direct impact of and the interplay between expectations, context, and empathy in driving brand selection. And we can also see the relative importance of each of these dimensions in driving choice. Now, when you look at these numbers, please realize they're just an average across multiple categories, multiple countries, and in fact, the weights are going to vary quite a lot by category, by place. Really, again, just don't worry. What you're seeing here is just an average. We always let the data tell the story. We never prescribe weights in advance. But I think the big takeaway here is that there is interplay between the dimensions. There's a direct impact on choice, and context plays a really big role in the equation. So when we're using this term context, what do we mean? So we're really talking about what's happening in a person's life and what's happening in the world around them. So through a commercial lens, you might even say that brand expectations are being shaped by, one, the external or the macro context, and that can take a lot of forms. It can be cultural relevance, so is a brand considered to be ahead of the times, behind the times, with the times? Is the brand seen as embracing sustainability, social justice, and doing so in an authentic way? And then there is the micro context, the internal context. Now here we're looking at personal needs, goals, the mission of the moment, even very pragmatic things like logistics. Where are you? Who are you with? What time of day is it? And of course, what needs are we trying to satisfy in that moment in time? So I think this is all essential knowledge to really build a brand, having a deep understanding of those everyday personal contexts of our target customers. So when we're talking about context here, we're referring to not only mission of the moment, but also what's happening in the world around them. And that's why it's showing up on that previous slide as such a key driver of choice. So speaking of cultural context, let's have a look here at Babel, because I think it's very fair to say that cultural context influences the way people view language learning in different countries. Now, all of the 4 countries pictured here, I think most people there would agree that learning a new language is a really good way to expand one's horizons and create new opportunities. But those opportunities are viewed quite differently depending on where you come from. So if you're in the UK or Germany, this might be more about diversity or even personal enrichment. If you're in France, it might be more about building confidence. But if you're in Brazil, it's really viewed as a career booster. So again, the motivation, can be quite different depending on your place on the planet. Now, another example of context. Let's look at streaming. I think this is a really cool example of the importance of the occasion and making sure we're measuring occasions and not just measuring kind of in this this big sort of amorphous researcher-created world of brand assessment. So first, the headline here is, we say that 56% of brand choice in video streaming is determined by context, and that's fine and that's true. But to bring that point home for you, when we go in and look at the occasion where you might be watching alone, or you might be watching just with your significant other, in those occasions, we find that Netflix tends to be the #1 brand selected, followed by Prime Video. But if you bring the family into the mix and all of a sudden kids are part of the viewing audience, then Netflix is still #1, but now the #2 position is occupied by Disney Plus. Makes sense? But watch this. When you look at a third occasion where you're doing something else, you might be multitasking, you might be cooking, you might be working out. Now all of a sudden, YouTube vaults to the #1 position. So what we're saying here is that the approach to brand measurement is uncovering truths that you would never learn by simply asking, out of context, what streaming brands people are aware of and which ones they prefer. So we're really able to tell the story of what different brands dominate in what different contexts. So what does all this mean? I think for marketers, it means, hey, we want to stay close to macro trends. We want to stay close to specific contexts and moments and occasions, and be ready to identify the white spaces, on that checkerboard. And in terms of what it means for the measurement community, I know there are a lot of us dialed into this particular webinar. Dynamic context means we got to do some things quite differently when it comes to brand measurement. So we want to frame the context in a realistic way. We want to frame the respondent exercises in a realistic way. Again, not something that's artificial, not something that is amorphous, but you want to give the respondent a very specific, relatable context in which to assess brands. Secondly, we want to be pragmatic about this. We want to tell a full story. So we need to open the door beyond just function and emotion to also incorporate things like societal drivers, things like cultural drivers, and just day-to-day pragmatic, occasional behavioral drivers. And then lastly, we want to be realistic and let the data tell us the story of what's going on, what's driving brand selection in a given category for a given brand in a given occasion, and not try to impose some static model or some static weights and again, kind of impose relative importance of sort of preconceived notions. Let the data tell the story. So to close this out, I think from a brand management standpoint, again, we're really trying to kind of push the point that we're all about shaping and fulfilling expectations, and doing so in context and with empathy. Now, next time on Keys, my friend Jillian Druitt is going to come in, and she's going to be talking about how we can only accomplish those things through total human understanding and empathy. So much more to come on that on the next edition of Keys. But I do want to leave you with this question. When we do measure strategic brand drivers, are we doing that in a realistic way? And are we really telling the full story? With that, I will leave you. And thank you so much, Simon. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Back over to you, Simon.
Well, thank you, Chris. And your point about letting the data tell the story, but also making sure we're collecting and thinking about the right kind of information we need is well made. And I was wondering, how dynamic is this situation about brand success? If we were having this webinar 10 years ago or 20 years ago, would you, and you had this kind of data then, would it be a same story or a different story? What's changing when it comes to brand success?
Great questions. Can I give you a two-part answer?
You may.
Okay, so part one of the things that gave rise to this entire effort of revisiting brand measurement was some findings that we had when we were looking at drivers pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. And we were seeing things moving around like we had never seen historically. So things that weren't even in models were vaulting all the way into top 5 position. Things that used to be really important were falling off, et cetera. So just a lot of movement. So it's like, okay, something's going on here and we need to make an adjustment. To answer the other part of your question, about things that might have changed over the last decade or so. I would say that 10 years ago, when we tried to build brand driver models and somehow wedge in things like environmental responsibility or social justice or something like that, usually they didn't fit in the models at all. If they did, it was a trace amount. But now that is completely different. In most categories, we see some type of powerful manifestation of societal drivers. So it's something that brands need to be increasingly mindful of and particularly authentic in the way they address those issues. So yeah, lots of changes, Simon, in the last decade.
Yeah, well, actually, hearing you say that, it reminded me of we had Fiona with us, probably it was about a year ago, Fiona, when you were talking about mask wearing. And because things had changed, you had to actually do some new research to understand what the customer experience was like when you're interacting with staff who were wearing masks. And I think one of the things that you found was that actually we can still learn quite a lot from human interactions, even if you only see part of the face. And that was a good example of that, wasn't it?
It was absolutely, yeah. I think that was a fascinating piece of research, actually, how much we get just from people's eyes and the sort of the top part of their face. So how much we could learn from that, and then yes, just the small number of cues that perhaps we get from the lower part of the face, as long as we can hear and we can interact that way.
Absolutely. Well, I'm talking of hearing and interacting. Boosie, you mentioned you've been on the road talking to clients about the findings and having discussions. What surprised you most when you were sharing this research with your clients?
I think the biggest surprises for us were the people that were in the room. It's often quite difficult to get C-suite into a room, and especially when it's something to do with marketing or with branding. But we not only had CEOs, CFOs, operations directors, etc., but they really lingered for a very long time. They stayed for the duration of the workshop, and then they stayed for conversations thereafter, because I think it's become so critical to understand how to speak to this band of consumers. And if you don't understand it, your brand is in trouble. But also, if you don't understand it, your organization is in trouble, because at the end of the day, diversity and empowerment is a business imperative. It's no longer just a nice to have. That's why I think people just came in their droves, and they sat and they lingered and they digested all of this. And it was amazing, just the depth of conversations that were being had.
And which were reverberating around the organisation, rather than,
Yes, yeah.
But I have to say that maybe some of our colleagues and clients on the call may reflect it's not always the case that people stay beyond the allotted time for a research results presentation. So that's a marker, I think, of the richness of this research. And yeah, absolutely. Well, and talking about the richness of research, Fiona, your chart with all of the countries that you were then giving us a tour, one of the clients on the call has been picking out a particular finding there. It's about you mentioned the Americans, and I might ask Chris to come in after, as somebody who's lived and worked in that country. But the question is, if Americans have a tendency to rank brands more positively, does that mean that some of the brand studies we're looking at maybe have a false positive read and are maybe overestimating just how healthy the brands are?
So I think if we're looking in market at a single market, then no. So we're not benchmarking that against anything else. If we were, for example, to be looking at, in fact, actually this is a live example. This is what got me hooked in cultural response bias. First of all, I was working with a client who, among their key markets, they had the US and Japan, and their initial program showed massive differences despite what they thought were sort of operational, sort of identical setups. And that's what got me hooked, because the results were so different that something cultural was clearly at play. So if they're drawing that comparison, then yes, we need to be careful. But if we're just in the US, then we're safe to be looking at those scores. We could potentially get into the being sort of regional variation across the width of the US. I don't know if that's something that Chris wants to jump in on, or if he's about to throttle me for mentioning that at this point. But we can also see variation across a single market as well. But yeah, if we're looking overall, then we don't need to worry.
Okay, well, actually, we'll go to Chris, and he's in the comparative mode anyway because he's in Spain, but he's perhaps looking across the Atlantic as well. So, Chris, any top tips when we're making comparisons within the US or indeed between the US and other countries?
Well, the bit about regions in the US in financial services, that's a tough one, right? Because depending on what state you are evaluating, that the competitive set can shift quite a lot because of the prominence of regional banking here. So yeah, that is a thing. And Simon, if I could, just speaking of banking, that's another kind of fun contextual comparison to make, because I spoke earlier about how contextual drivers differ so much from one category to the next. Banking is one of those where very pragmatic drivers really do arise. So things, I use the term satisficing, being just good enough, that can be a reason for retention, right? Because if you think about all the hassles, all the impediments to like changing your checking account, people are very reluctant to make a move. So if you're assessing a bank, whether it's a national one or a regional one, you want to make sure that you're balancing kind of its assessment on rational and emotional factors with very pragmatic drivers of actual behavior. Again, so you can tell that complete story of what's really going on with your brand.
Yeah, absolutely. That actually, the story came through very clearly on the video streaming, but a different mindset in terms of thinking through when we're exploring other sectors. So, point well made. And Boosie, just one final question, perhaps for you. We're going on the road now again, aren't we? To Kenya, to Nigeria.
And Egypt.
And to Egypt. And
yeah.
Have you started that work, or is that something which is going to play out in the coming months?
So it will be playing out in the next coming months, because we've got to put the work together, and curation does take time. The first one will probably be Kenya. That will be ready, but Egypt is already a work in progress anyway. But we'll keep you posted in terms of where we are. But yeah, it is exciting that we're going on the road, because obviously the similarities and the differences, it will be amazing to see what that's like just across the African continent.
Absolutely, and I think one marker as we finish the webinar for colleagues on the call is we do have a study called Ipsos Global Trends, which has just released, which includes 50 markets. So really gives us the opportunity to look at many different countries, including a number within Africa, but not only. So that's something which I think can help us really delve even more into this issue of context, cultures, and indeed communities, and how to do a better job at understanding them. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers. I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us on the call today. We'll be sharing the deck and the resources with you. And Chris mentioned our next webinar. We're going on the road, and we're going to try and find out more about empathy. We're going to try and devote ourselves to thinking about the empathy effect. That will be on the 27th of April, and we'll be taking forward the stories about brands. We're going to be taking forward the story also looking particularly about how we can communicate well in a way that resonates well with people, grounded in their real lives and the real experiences that they have these days. So thank you for joining us today, and I hope we can see you again in a little over a month's time for the next episode of Keys.
Thank you so much, Simon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.